Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We actually are making that look easy again. We sort of forgot how with the pandemic, but it's almost back. So this morning is the second talk in a series of 4 based on a teaching by the founder of this tradition, Dogen Zenji, called the Bendowa, or a talk on the wholehearted practice of the way. And I wanted to start with going back to last week a little bit. Last week I talked a bit about engaging with Buddhist texts in a different way than our kind of normal way of reading things to extract information. And after the talk, someone came up to me and said that when I was reading a little bit of the Bendowa, that they felt themselves tear up and were really moved, even though they didn't necessarily explicitly understand what Dogen was saying. And that was just such a perfect illustration to me of why it's important, or a reason that it's important, to engage in texts in a different way, to develop a relationship that isn't just based on our intellectual understanding. We tend to be drawn around, driven by our thinking mind, right? And we're all a little different in that. If you're an artist or a musician or an athlete, you're deeply in touch with other ways of knowing, but it still tends to be dominant, this thinking, language-oriented mind. But we are more than that. A large part of ourself, maybe the larger part, is beyond our perception. We can't see it, but it still fully informs our experience, fully participates in our life. And when we engage with texts in a different kind of relationship that isn't just based in our intellectual thinking, it lets us bring that whole self into the inquiry. So you're bigger than you think you are, and all the parts of you are important. And that segues into what I want to talk about today, which is a little bit about the nature of the self. So the Bendowa is a talk on the wholehearted practice of the way. And in it, Dogen Zenji is telling us to actively take up practice. Last week, I talked a little bit about the nature of that activity. And this week, I want to take up the nature of that self that engages in practice. So I want to start with the opening paragraph of the Bendowa. All Buddha Tathagatas together have been simply transmitting wondrous Dharma and actualizing Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, for which there is an unsurpassable, unfabricated, wondrous method. This wondrous Dharma, which has been transmitted only from Buddha to Buddha without deviation, has as its criterion Jikie Zanmai. For disporting oneself freely in this samadhi, practicing zazen in an upright posture is the true gate. So this wondrous Dharma, which has been transmitted only from Buddha to Buddha without deviation, has as its criterion Jikie Zanmai. And Jikie Zanmai is one of the central concepts in the Bendowa. And it translates as self-receiving and self-employing samadhi. The self-receiving, self-employing samadhi. So Zanmai means samadhi, which is generally translated as the concentration achieved in meditation, right? The total absorption in meditation. And Jikie Zanmai is self-receiving, self-employing. So this wondrous Dharma that is transmitted from Buddha to Buddha has as its criterion self-receiving, self-employing samadhi. We can know that it is this wondrous Dharma because it relies on self-receiving, self-employing samadhi. And I'm not going to talk a lot about trying to explain what that Jikie Zanmai is. There is a wonderful text that we studied last term with Hojo-san called Jikie Uzanmai by a Dharma descendant of Dogen. And it's wonderful. I highly encourage you to read it. And I do want to share the first few lines of that text to just kind of give us an image that he puts forward of this Jikie Uzanmai. So Menzan says, the Tathagata inwardly illuminates the true Dharma world with the light of wisdom. This is based on the concept action of self-employment, GGU. Self-enjoyment, GGU. The Tathagata outwardly illuminates people and teaches them with the light of his body. This is based on the concept action of other enjoyment, Tajiyu. So this GGU, or just have this image of here's a Buddha, a Tathagata, it's another name for a Buddha, sitting in meditation, inwardly illuminating the entire Dharma world. And in this wonderful commentary on the Bendowa called The Wholehearted Way by Uchiyama Roshi, Uchiyama Roshi quotes his teacher Sawaki Roshi as defining GGU as the self making the self into the self. So this is the self that is completely the self with nothing outside of it. And we're used to talking more about the teaching of no self than the teaching of this self that is only the self. And maybe that is because I'm not you feels a little more accessible to our normal way of thinking than I'm not me, right? But it's actually a little bit more subtle than that, and it's also important. Right? It's easy to understand that on a basic level, I'm not you, right? If I cut myself, you don't bleed. And I don't ever really know what your thoughts are. I can't ever really know what your experience is, no matter how much I want to, which hurts us with the people that we're closest to. And we can also talk about that in terms of perspective, right? I'm sitting over here, Daoren's sitting over there. So even though we're both looking at the clock, we're going to see it differently, right? Just from a totally physically perspective, we're seeing it from a different place, and we can't ever really share that. But also, I'm seeing whatever I'm seeing completely as me, with my causes and conditions, my karma, and everything I see is filtered through that perception. And so we're never going to quite see the same thing because we're not perceiving it through the same being, right? Through the same causes and conditions. And Uchiyama Roshi talks a lot about this self that can't share, like he says, can't share so much as a fart with another person. He really likes bodily functions. It's fun. And he talks about how our normal perception of life is that the world is like a stage, and that when we're born, we walk onto that stage, and when we die, we step off it. And he says that's not actually how it is fundamentally. That when we're born, our whole world is born with us, and when we die, our whole world dies with us. And in those kind of most powerful experiences of our lives, we can see that that's true, right? When your child is born, there is a whole new world that has your child in it. And the life that was before is gone, right? You remember it, but it's gone, for better or for worse, right? And when someone who is central to your life dies, the whole world that had them in it is gone. I was working a lot in the last week with someone who just lost her child. And she just kept saying, I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. How could there be a world that doesn't have my son in it? And that's what it's like, right? And of course, it's also true that their life is never cut off. and completely exists and is with us all the time, but we don't experience those two things at the same time. Okay? So, what about the teachings of no self? Right? That is one of the 4 seals of the Dharma, like the 4 marks by which you know that it's the Dharma. It's that all phenomena are completely empty and devoid of self. So when we say that all things are devoid of self, we're saying they are empty of self-nature, they're empty of a separate, enduring self. And we talk about this a lot. Hojo-san talked about it eloquently on Thursday night. But I am completely dependent on everything else in the world being exactly as it is. You know, the plants of the whole world make the air that I breathe. The food that I eat becomes my body. That food is dependent on the people that grew it, on the soil that it grew out of. That soil is made up of the bodies of countless other beings, of mountains that have been ground down to dust. Me being exactly who and what I am is dependent on my family, on the culture that I was born into, the time and place that I live, and on every interaction I've ever had with any other being, right? And in a purely physical sense, I can't point to anything that is specifically, essentially me, right? I'm made up of elements that have been other things. They come together to be this body for a brief time, and then they're going to go and be other things. So there's nothing I can point to as being essentially and only me. So we have no self, and we have the self that is only the self with nothing outside of it. And how is it that those two things are not in opposition to each other? So I want to read the first paragraph of what's called the Jikie on my section of the Bendowa. When one displays the Buddha mudra with one's whole body and mind, sitting upright in this samadhi, even for a short time, everything in the entire Dharma world becomes Buddha mudra, and all space in the universe completely becomes enlightenment. Therefore, it enables Buddha Tathagatas to increase the Dharma joy of their own original grounds and renew the adornment of the way of awakening. Simultaneously, all living beings of the Dharma world in the 10 directions and 6 realms become clear and pure in body and mind, realize great emancipation, and their own original face appears. At that time, all things together awaken to supreme enlightenment and utilize Buddha body, immediately go beyond the culmination of awakening, and sit upright under the kingly Bodhi tree. At the same time, they turn the incomparable great Dharma wheel and begin expressing ultimate and unfabricated profound prajna. So I don't want to try and explain that too much. That's not the point of it, right? Just let it roll around. And keep open that question of how is it that those two ways of talking about the self are not in opposition to each other. Here Dogen gives us this fleshy, funky, human, zazen person, right? Realizing, actualizing the whole Dharma world that contains absolutely everything and is completely endowed with Buddha nature, right? How is that? And I'll just say that not me and not you doesn't add up to not anything. It adds up to boundless, right? It adds up to no edges, this whole wondrous Dharma world. So I also want to talk about a danger that Dogen talks about at length in this. As we idealize this image, whatever image we come up with, of this state of Jikie Zanmai, it's easy to see that as what's real and our kind of fleshy body daily life as something extra and not desirable, right? We want to grab onto this kind of beautiful, oh, all beings are awakening into illumination, right? And let go of all this stuff that feels awkward and difficult. So in the questions, in question 10, Dogen's imaginary questioner says, if you really understand that the mind nature existing in our body is not subject to birth and death, then since it is the original nature, although the body is only a temporary form haphazardly born here and dying, the mind is permanent and unchangeable in the past, present, and future. To know this is called release from life and death. Those who know this principle will forever extinguish their rounds of life and death, and when their bodies perish, they enter into the ocean of original nature. When they stream into this ocean, they are truly endowed with the same wondrous virtues as the Buddha Tathagatas. So Dogen says this is the fallacious view of Sanika, or also Shrenika in some other places. And Shrenika was a Brahmin teaching at the time of the historical Buddha. And these are the teaching traditions that the historical Buddha would have grown up in and practiced in before he was unsatisfied and went off to practice on his own. And the teaching that this is expressing is the teaching of Atman, or universal self, right? And that's exactly the opposite of Anatman, or no self. That's the Sanskrit word that we're translating as no self, Anatman. And Dogen is very derisive. You know, how could you be so stupid as to possibly think this? You know, only a complete and total idiot would think this is the Buddha Dharma. But he also devotes 3 pages to it. So obviously it's a common, easy slip, right? And when you listen to, if you listen to high-level yogic teachers in those traditions talking about Atman, about the universal self, it doesn't sound so different than Buddhist teachers talking about Anatman. But it has real implications for how we practice. In those traditions that focus on Atman, there's a tendency towards methods to transform myself into something that can unite with universal self by stripping away all the unnecessary bits of the small self, right? It tends toward an understanding that every being is sacred because they aren't what they seem to be. They're really this universal self that is the same in each of us, and the particular details of each being don't matter. So if you swap out the words Buddha nature for universal self, it starts to sound really familiar. Okay? If I strip away all the extra parts of myself that are problematic, I will get down to this core Buddha nature that is ideal and right and somehow feels everlasting, right? Because it's our original face. And if I could just strip away and get down to that Buddha nature, then everything would be good. So Dogen is offering us something else. Every being is sacred because it is made up of absolutely everything, with nothing outside. Each thing is exactly a complete manifestation of the entire universe, and its particular details matter completely. And Dogen tells us that mind and body are not two, right? We cannot separate. and that life and death are exactly nirvana. So I am fundamentally empty of self-nature, and I'm also completely endowed with Buddha nature, but that doesn't let me off the hook of living out this embodied life. It doesn't let me get off the hook of living this life where I am completely not you, where I can't share so much as a fart with anybody else. Right? I can't escape the difficulties of my life, of my particular karmic situation, which is not the same as your particular karma. It also means I can't fix anything for anyone else. And in the Genjo Koan, Dogen says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And because practice never stops, studying the self never stops. Just like anything else in Buddha Dharma, we're never going to get down to a place where like, got it. Don't have to think about that anymore. And whether I am talking about the self from the side of no self, or from the side of the self that is completely the self, with nothing else outside of it, both of those are completely whole and completely not two. And there's a whole lot more that we can say about the self, and the hard part, and the hard part for me in giving these talks is like stripping it down and not going off on tons of digressions and talking for an hour instead of half an hour. So I just want to leave with that to touch into the reality that we are completely whole is to be free from grasping, right? It's to be in a place where nothing is missing. And when we get a glimpse of that, we are completely wonderstruck by the wholeness of absolutely everything else. So that's what I've got for today. And we've got time for questions.
Okay. So you were saying the whole self and no self, and then you merged it, right? So you're not going to have that duality. So could you say more about no self and how we live in that state or don't live in that state, or where is that in our consciousness? Does that make sense? As an inquiry, I don't quite know what I'm trying to say here, but what do we really mean by no self?
What do we really mean by no
in our
self?
consciousness, or something like that.
So when we talk about no self, the first place that I always go is dependent co-origination. Right? That there is nothing that is distinctly me that is not completely dependent on everything else. An important part of that is when that becomes a kind of a oneness, and when I look out in the world, I don't see anything that's separate from me. I mean, assuming that I can actually look out in the world and see that. But an important piece is that doesn't mean that I see me everywhere, right? It's not projecting me-ness onto everything, right? It's looking out into the world and seeing not me, from which I am not separate. And it's all looking back at me. And that's not actually any different than talking about the self that is only the self with nothing outside of it. They're two different ways of expressing the same thing, but it feels very different to me if I'm talking about this me, this body that feels alone, and that in some ways does this life completely alone. And when I'm talking about this self that is completely reliant on everything else. How does that appear in our consciousness? I don't know that I know where for me, where I feel that is in those parts of our being that are not in our conscious mind, right? I can have some intellectual picture of that, but how I find that unfolding in my life, I always have to come back to this feeling in my gut, right? It's about how I actually unfold and meet other beings that reinforces that understanding. And how I feel it is like there's this, Hojo-san uses the word well at the center of your being. Sometimes it feels to me like the hollow inside of a mountain, right? But there is this opening that life unfolds through that is the same in me as it is in you, but that doesn't mean we're just the same. It's the same source that is unfolding. And each of us are completely a manifestation of that. I don't know that that really responds, but that's where I've got.
Thank you very much.
Jikie, maybe this is what you were talking about, but as you were speaking, I was thinking about Dogen's teaching of dropping off body and mind. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because that can be very easily misunderstood.
So that at the end, when I mentioned from the Genjo koan, when Dogen says to study the Buddha way is to study the self, it goes on to say to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by all things. And to be verified by all things is to let the body and mind of self and the body and mind of other drop away. And we tend to want to go kind of skip all the middle and go to study the Buddha way is to let the body and mind of self and other drop away. And all of those lines are important, and they're all happening all the time. It's not like we progress through seeing each of them. And I want to say that they're not separate from each other. And, we experience kind of one side or the other all the time. A conventional way to kind of talk about that is that we study the self, and as we see into the nature of ourselves, right? As we study that in Zazen primarily, right? We see that there is nothing we can grab onto that is us. So we forget the self. And when that happens, we see that we are completely dependent on everything else. We are verified by all things. And then that body and mind of each thing drops off as we get to see into that complete expression of all things that each of us are, regardless of our particularities. Like our particularities matter completely, and also they don't, right? A part of that really jumps out at me, I'm sorry, this is a slight digression from what you were actually saying, is this is where when I think about not projecting meanness onto the world, which is really important. It's really easy for us to do. There's this kind of like, let's all sing Kumbaya, we're all one thing that is really about, oh, I feel so warm and fuzzy, everything is me, right? And that's not where we're going. And that verified by all things is one place that jumps out at me. It's not that when I achieve some mental state and forget the self that I verify everything else. I am verified by all things, right? And it's an important difference.
Jikie.
Yeah.
This is a metaphor that's in my kind of floats around in my mind about the relationship between no self and like absolute complete self. Is that the terms we're using or something like that? And I'm curious what you think about it. If I'm on the right track, I guess. And the metaphor is language, and for me, I find the language is kind of rather kind of miraculous thing, in that it exists in one sense as this kind of abstract system of meaning, but it only exists because I have a thought. When I have a thought or I speak, I kind of draw on this whole system, and in the act of speaking, I actually enact and enliven and activate this system, that it won't exist except to the extent that I say something. And once I say something, it seems like it's coming from me, and it is coming from me, but it also makes this whole other system of meaning possible. Without the individual speaking, there's nothing. And in another dimension of it for me is in the act of thinking, which, for me, I guess for most people, we think we have an idea in our head. It seems like this most intimate and private place we can go to think a thought inside of ourselves. But in the act of the thinking, we're forced into relationship with the whole system of meaning at the same time, and neither can exist without the other. And so this is kind of, as a metaphor, this is kind of, to me, this kind of lovely interplay between this thing of like almost like selfing and participating in this larger phenomenon.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I think, right at the beginning of the Bendowa, and Dogen says, although all things are completely endowed with this wondrous Dharma, it's not actualized unless we practice. That's kind of like the crux of what's happening here is this Buddha nature is everywhere, and you are completely it, no matter what you do, right? The Dharma is completely there, no matter whether we're acting on it or not. But nothing happens. It's not actualized in the world. It doesn't become our life unless we stand up and do something. And I think that's the central theme of the whole text. Absolutely. Thank you.
Jikie. Could you talk a little about working with judgment, self-judgment, judgment of others, particularly in Zazen? But also in life, of course, the rest of life.
Judgment is hard. We have it all the time, right? It's part of being human. And we like things and we don't like things. There's a line from one of the things we chant in the morning that the great way is not difficult if only you don't pick and choose. And I always envision the ancestor who wrote that having a good laugh when they said that, because we pick and choose everything all the time. We always have some internal commentary going, right? I noticed that I'm just walking down the street. Oh, I like this. I don't like that. I like this. I don't like that. You're like, why do I even need to have an opinion? It's got nothing to do with me, right? But I do. And we can be especially really harsh on ourselves, right? And I think the advice with that is to just turn that tenderness and remember that to study something, we talked about this in our forms class a little bit. I think if we were to become a biologist and study butterflies, it's not because we want to change butterflies because we think something's wrong with them, right? It's because we love butterflies and we think they're amazing. And if we can turn just a little bit of that into the study of the self and to what it is to be human, it allows that to soften up a lot. And the way we judge ourselves harshly is exactly related to how we judge others harshly, right? And the more that we can soften up on how we judge ourselves, that judgment of others will completely relax as well. And I would point anybody back to Hojo-san's talk on Thursday, where he was talking about regarding the world, regarding things as Buddha, and to take that up as a practice. So if there's somebody that's particularly irritating, practice regarding them as Buddha and see what happens.
Jikie, I'm very interested in the way Dogen regards our experience of time. Just a whole other term we can talk about. But when you had evoked this mystery of death, and either our own death or the death of a loved one, maybe not our own death. Let's talk about death, because that's a whole other thing. Right? But that we experience this whole world that had them in it is gone, in the same way that they brought a whole world with them when they were born. And those moments feel really like macro, kind of big. Those are big gateways for us. But in the way that Dogen talks about the Dharma position of wood and Dharma, can you talk maybe a little bit in the micro sense that, in the same way that the world that a loved one brought with them disappears, that each moment, like the moment just before is also, that world is gone as well. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that micro sense that moment to moment is passing?
Yeah. So, what Jacqueline was just referencing is, and I can't remember for a second exactly what text it comes out of, but that when we talk about firewood, right, wood exists in the Dharma position of wood, and ash exists in the Dharma position of ash, and we don't talk about wood becoming ash, and in the same way we don't talk about life becoming death, right? That each thing can exist wholly in the Dharma position, which is kind of a way of saying a moment in time without getting lost in the fact that time doesn't really work how we think it does, right? That each one exists completely, and we're experiencing one or we're experiencing the other, but they don't oppose each other. And the way I think about that in just kind of the normal unfolding of our lives is that this is the imagery of my mind. We'll see how it goes. But it's kind of like an axis, like we're going to make a graph for math, right? And we think of ourselves as being on this vertical axis and going from here to there. And we kind of hunker down, and I kind of have a picture of Tron, right? The little light cards going along the light beam. And we think that that's what we're doing. And really, that's not how our life unfolds. We're this point on the line, but that point is actually a plane, right? The horizontal goes out infinitely. And even when we think about that, when we get into be here now, or just be present with the current moment, we're still kind of envisioning that, okay, I'm present in this present moment, but it's going from here to there, right? And actually that horizontal plane is infinitely deep. So there's no separation from what came behind or what came before or is going to come in the future. But also, it's not really a continuous line from then to there, right? There's what was in the past and there's what was in the future, and it's not actually in a linear progression. And we can't experience it that way, actually. That's how we think about it, but what we are actually experiencing is exactly now, which is arising and falling away completely. And the technical term is a thought moment, right? That the world is created and destroyed in each thought moment, which is like some infinitesimally small fraction of a second that we can't imagine. And that's kind of how it is, right? And most of the time, the world that recreates in the next thought second is pretty close, right? It doesn't feel like there's a break. It feels like it's continuous. But when some big change happens, whether it's somebody being born or somebody dying or that moment when you like trip and fall and you have that, oh God, everything's about to change when I hit the ground moment, or when we have a moment of awakening, right? And everything turns over and nothing's changed, but actually our whole world is different. That all of those are kind of places where it feels like the world that followed 1 second to the next is fundamentally different. That landed all, I hope.
Jikie.
Yeah.
How does receiving happen? I'm not going to elaborate, but
Receiving is the only way anything happens. But do you want to elaborate?
in this interdependence, right? No outside. Where's the place for receiving? I could say where's the place for giving,
Right.
too. But
Right, exactly. On the one hand, we're not separate. And so there's nothing to give, nothing to receive, and nothing to be received, right? It's the emptiness of the three wheels, giver, receiver, and gift, right? There's nothing there. And on the other hand, absolutely everything that can happen, everything that can unfold, is a gift that we are receiving. And that's the miraculous thing.